Good evening, everyone. My name is Erin Bartram. I'm the school program coordinator here at the Mark Twain House and Museum, and I'm delighted to host this evening's program on behalf of the museum here in Hartford. Tonight, we're welcoming Cynthia Tucker and Frye Gaillard for a discussion of their new book, The Southernization of America, A Story of Democracy in the Balance. I'll introduce both of them in just a moment, but first I want to thank our sponsors for tonight's event. The museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We're happy to honor his memory with these programs, which we know he would have loved so much. We're also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and CT Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all our other virtual programs. One of the benefits of this being a virtual program, of course, is that you as the audience can have your own conversation in the chat alongside our guests' discussion tonight, and we encourage you to do so. We'll also be posting the link to purchase a signed copy of The Southernization of America from the Mark Twain store. Getting your copy through our store not only gets you a signed copy of the book, but it also benefits the museum and everything we do here. If you have a specific question for Cynthia and Frye, you can go ahead and post that directly into the Ask a Question section. It should be to the left of the chat, right under the green bar at the bottom of your screen. As for that green bar, if you're enjoying the program this evening and would like to support the museum, you can click on that link to donate through Birdies for Charity, where your gift will grow 15%, thanks to Webster Bank's support of the Bonus Bucks pool. Now that I've said all that, let's formally introduce our guests for the evening. Frye Gaillard is a writer in residence at the University of South Alabama, a former Southern editor at the Charlotte Observer, and the author of more than 30 books exploring themes of social justice and Southern music, religion, politics, and culture. His award-winning titles have ranged across the genres of history, memoir, journalism, and historical novels for young readers. 3 of his books have been adapted as public television documentaries, and Gaillard has co-authored the script for 2 of those, including the Emmy-winning In the Path of the Storms. His critically praised books have included A Hard Rain, America in the 1960s, an NPR Great Read of 2018 and winner of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Prize, Cradle of Freedom, Alabama and the Movement That Changed America, winner of the Lillian Smith Book Award, The Dream Long Deferred, the landmark struggle for desegregation in Charlotte, North Carolina, for which he received the NAACP Legal Defense Fund Humanitarian of the Year Award, and Watermelon Wine, the Spirit of Country Music, featured in the Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville. Also joining us is Cynthia Tucker, a veteran newspaper journalist and Pulitzer Prize winner. Formerly a visiting professor of journalism and Charlene Hunter Galt Distinguished Writer in Residence at the University of Georgia, she's currently the journalist in residence at the University of South Alabama. She's also a highly regarded commentator on TV and radio news shows. She was the editorial page editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for 17 years, where she led the development of opinion policy. More recently, she was that newspaper's Washington-based political columnist. She maintains a syndicated column, which is published in dozens of newspapers around the country. In 2007, she won the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary. She's also received numerous other awards, including Journalist of the Year from the National Association of Black Journalists. So please sit back and enjoy. Don't forget there'll be Q&A at the end of the program. Make sure to post your questions. And I'd like to welcome Frye and Cynthia.
Thanks, Erin.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Excellent. Well, I want to first start by telling you how much, and I have it here, how much I enjoyed reading the book. And it is wonderful, just for folks who may be unfamiliar. It is a collection of essays, which is kind of a nice thing to encounter. It was nice to kind of dip in and read a little bit here and there. And so I really wondered if we could start with, what you both think the Southernization of America means to you, and how it connects to this one particular book that you mention in your introduction.
Cynthia, you want me to start with that?
Please.
In 1974, a really fine Southern journalist named John Egerton wrote a book called The Americanization of Dixie, the Southernization of America. And his thesis was that the isolation that had defined the South, he thought, for much of its history was beginning to break down. That interstate highways and television and increased travel, and if he were writing today, he would say the internet, all of those things have decreased the isolation of any part of the country from other parts of the country. And John's fear was that as that was happening, the South and the rest of the country were not making each other better, they were making each other worse. And one of his fears in particular was that the South, which had been the epicenter of racism, with all of the undemocratic tendencies, with all of the violence that goes with that, going back to colonial times and slavery on through the Civil War, the end of Reconstruction, the violence of those times, the resistance to the Civil Rights Movement, all of that history from the South was kind of metastasizing, John feared, into the rest of the country. It was becoming our export. Now, at the time that John wrote this, I thought he was too pessimistic because this was 1974, and you looked around and the civil rights movement really had changed some things in the South. We didn't segregate lunch counters or buses or all those stupid things anymore. And we had New South governors, as they were called, a Republican named Linwood Holton in Virginia, a Democrat named Reuben Askew in Florida, and of course Jimmy Carter in Georgia. And all of them were saying it's time to put this segregation idiocy behind us and move forward together to build a more inclusive country, to make a great country even greater. But then time goes on, and Cynthia, I think both of us have wondered if John wasn't more prescient than we may have thought at the time.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. So one day last week, the Washington Post had a front page story about George Wallace's presidential campaigns and how they had laid the foundation for Donald Trump's presidency. Frye and I spotted this way back in 2015. In 2015, Donald Trump came to Mobile. About 30 or 40,000 people came to a stadium, football stadium here to hear him speak. And I didn't go. I just watched some outtakes on television. And watching Trump speak, I heard George Wallace. All of the grievance was there, the white grievance, Wallace's way of insisting that whites, particularly working class whites, were the victims, and they were right to feel victimized by the so-called elites. All of the anger, all of the rage was there as Trump spoke, and all of the intimations of violence. Wallace had a way of suggesting, usually without saying so outright, that people who disagreed with him, particularly journalists, perhaps should be hurt. Trump did exactly the same thing. So one of the ways that we saw the Southernization of America was Donald Trump borrowing from George Wallace's playbook. It's not clear how many presidential primaries Wallace would have won in 1972 if he had not been shot. But we know that Trump went on to win the Republican nomination and the presidency. So that's one way of thinking about the Southernization of America. Now, it is also true that there are other strains. Frye and I see parallel strains and habits of mind coming out of the South. Some of them are malicious, oppressive, racist, but there are other traits, other strains, which are much more noble. And we hope that more of those will seep out into the rest of the nation as well. We believe that America wasn't really a democracy until the civil rights movement, which was mostly fought in the South. Once Black Americans had the right to vote without intimidation, without the threat of violence, then other Americans of color, Native Americans, Latinos began to think, we're part of this country too. We have the right to vote. And so that's one of the more noble strains that came out of the South. The question is, which of those strains will predominate in the future?
Yeah, and I love the phrase in the book, I think, is Black Americans forced America to become a democracy in the 1960s. And I'm glad that you kind of were both speaking about the time that you were talking about, because I think it's actually really important how key the 1970s are in parts of this book. And there's some really pivotal moments in here in the 70s, some moments when a different future kind of seemed possible. And I would often encounter undergraduates in my US history classes whose high school teachers had never brought them past the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 64, 65. There was a real parallel to never having been taught what came after the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments in the late 1860s.
Yes.
And thinking about what enters into history and can be interrogated, even when it's in living memory, I think is a really provocative part of this. Why do you think it's so important to revisit the 70s when we're thinking about the currents that you're investigating in these pieces?
To me, both sides of the equation that Cynthia was talking about became vivid in the 70s. On the one hand, you had Jimmy Carter running for president, and his whole human rights policy was central to the kind of message and vision of America that he was trying to offer to the world and to the citizens of this country. And he viewed that as an extension of the lessons learned from the civil rights movement. So you had this white guy, peanut farmer from the very deep South, trying to reconnect the country with its finest instincts. At least that's how it looked to me. I remember the moment when Carter accepted the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party, and he stood on the stage at the convention side by side with Martin Luther King Sr., another native Georgian. And Daddy King looked out across the masses of people there and all the balloons and the cacophony of cheers and all of that. And he says, surely the Lord is in this place. It had the feeling of a revival, but not just a religious revival, a revival of that sort of dream deferred that, that we hoped that we might overcome the darkest qualities and stains in our history and our character. But at the same time, you had this emerging idea of a Southern strategy that began with Richard Nixon and continued in the early campaign of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And they didn't, by Southern strategy, they didn't mean any of that Carter or Martin Luther King Sr. were talking about. They meant the opposite of it. They were counting on the fact that sense of grievance and that sense of white privilege and that toxic brand of whiteness was so deeply entrenched in the South that they could win the South with that and then expand their political power beyond that. And, tragically, there's evidence that calculation was pretty much on the money.
Yeah, Cynthia, I wasn't sure if you wanted to respond.
No, I think that Frye's right on. I mean, one of the reasons, it's interesting, Aaron, that you say so many high school students haven't gone back past the 60s, as if everything stopped then. There was, I remember that my parents believed after the civil rights movement that their children would have so many more opportunities than they did. I graduated from college in the 70s, and indeed, things were beginning to change. The South was beginning to change. The nation was beginning to change. It seemed that things were moving in the right direction. At the same time, there was this undercurrent that Frye just referred to, where there were still all of these alienated, aggrieved white Southerners who were not happy with the changes. And as it turns out, they weren't the only ones. While the South might have been the epicenter of racism, this resentment was spread out all over the country. After all, again, when George Wallace ran for the presidency, he had fans in the Northeast and the Midwest. He won primaries in the Midwest. And so this sense of white grievance wasn't just confined to the South.
Yeah, that's interesting. As we're talking about this, I'm sort of thinking about the form of the word Southernized, because one thing I noticed is the prominence of Nixon and Reagan, two California men. And there's been a lot of work on sort of studying the way that the modern conservative movement has had significant roots in California, in Orange County specifically, but more broadly, and thinking of, we've used the metaphor of that this has metastasized, but also thinking about Southernized as an active process being engaged in and facilitated by those from without who are sort of reforming and recasting the shape of discourse in lots of other places. And of course, with plenty of historical roots for doing so. The second Klan's biggest states were New York, Illinois, and Indiana. And one thing I really noticed, and I really appreciated that you did this, there's a lot of journalists in this book, and you were really careful about saying where those journalists were from and where they were going to report. And it made me think of, going as far back as Frederick Law Olmsted and Fanny Kemble writing from the South. There's a great piece by Sidney Andrews, maybe, in the Atlantic in like 1865, where he's sort of doing this, he's gone to the South and he's sort of explaining what's there. And it was really interesting to read about how journalists traveling to the South were interpreting what they were seeing, and journalists from the South were traveling other places. But one thing that's sort of in the background of the period you're studying is a polite term is consolidation, a more realistic term is collapse of media in the country and jobs in journalism. And I wonder the extent to which that has shaped the stories that can be told or even seen, let alone really nuanced stories of all of this.
I think that's a really good point. One of the things that I remember a conversation I was lucky enough to have with the late, great John Lewis, in which John was a very gracious person, but he was talking to me as a journalist, and he was saying that he hoped I and other journalists would never underestimate the importance of journalists bearing witness during the civil rights years. That he thought that was key to the message getting out and being understood, and not that the journalists had to be advocates, but just that they had to be truth tellers. And I think the capacity of American journalism, at least at the regional level, to do this has declined during the period of time we're talking about. And I think that hurts. I think I think it leaves us more open to more toxic ways of spreading misinformation. So I think that's an interesting insight.
I agree completely. And I would like to add to that the way in which news media have become increasingly polarized. I'm not talking about journalism as Frye and I have practiced it. I'm talking about radio talk show hosts, cable shows such as Fox News. It used to be true when there were more local newspapers, people were more likely to have more than one source of information. If they're getting all of their news from Fox or some right-wing radio talk show host, then it is much more likely that they are getting misinformation, outright lies, and a false picture of what's going on in the country. And I think that's one of the things that is hurting democracy in this country.
I wonder, I was thinking about Mark Twain as a journalist and a writer and an observer and a person who came from what we would have thought of as the West when he was born, but then kind of captures this Southernness. And I was mentioning this in the green room. There's a line from Life on the Mississippi where he says, "In the South, the war is what AD is elsewhere. They date from it." But one thing I thought was really interesting in reading this, and again, it's because you're focusing on recent history, at least in terms of when we talk about history, is the way I was surprised sometimes at the timeline of things or how quickly things just snowballed into something else. The essay, the traumas of the new millennium, as someone who is an elder millennial, I was 18 and voted in the election in 2000. It was a really difficult essay to read. And even tonight, having been a teenager when Columbine happened, I'm the person that was promised will fix all of this. And then I ended up in a college classroom being told the only thing you can do is carry a gun yourself. So I wondered if when you revisited all of this, which you yourselves have lived through, if there were moments that struck you as either you forgot how close those things were to each other, you forgot how quickly things changed, you kind of had things mixed up even in your own lived experience and how you remember it.
Cynthia, you want to go with that or you want me to start?
Well, let me start by saying, Aaron, since you're a historian, I want to be clear that while everything that we wrote is accurate, it is certainly not a history.
Yes.
It is my impressions of what was important and Frye's impressions of what was important over the half century or so since Egerton published his book. But there were things that I reconsidered. I thought of them as important at the time, but I had forgotten about them as time passed. And one was Bush v. Gore and the Supreme Court's decision in that. Because I think that was a moment, just as we were entering the new century, when the Supreme Court was showing itself as already a partisan group. The Supreme Court put its foot on the scale in that election. And what has happened in the ensuing decades is that it has just gotten more and more partisan. It is not a neutral arbiter of justice. And in the Bush v. Gore ruling, I think that Sandra Day O'Connor, who voted with the conservative majority, later had second thoughts about that, about how the Supreme Court intervened and gave the election to Bush. So that is one of the things that, as we look at what has happened to the Supreme Court more recently, I think we can see traces of that in Bush v. Gore.
Yeah, I think the traumas of the new millennium, that title, occurred to us when we started putting together things that happened in rapid succession. There was Bush v. Gore and that sense of uncertainty about the real outcome of a presidential election. That was unsettling at the time. And then the next year, in President Bush's first year in office, you had the trauma of 9/11, which just elevated hugely the fear of the other that, all people have. Americans have always had it, but it became a kind of force in our body politic that, to a degree that was startling in the early years of the new millennium. And then you had in 2008 the election of our first African-American president. And in the minds of many people, that appeared to be a triumph of the other, because the backlash against President Obama was not a question of people disagreeing with his policies. I mean, fair enough if you disagree with policies. That's what we do in America. It's what we should do. We should debate policies. But that wasn't what happened in large measure. We had people questioning where he was born. We had people insisting that he must be a Muslim. But it was even worse than that on the internet. If you looked at some of the horrifying things that were said about, literally dehumanizing the President of the United States and the First Lady. And in this time of politicized insanity with guns, somebody took a shot at the bedroom where the first family slept. That person is now in prison. So, you could see something that I thought maybe didn't exist in the country. I thought that the election of a Black president was a plateau from which we could continue to make progress. And it turned out to be something very different than that, a warning of how far, a profound warning of how far we still had to go.
Yeah, there's a quote that has really stuck with me from the book, and I haven't been able to shake it. It is fairly recent. It's from an evangelical preacher. Who said, "Compromise is the lifeblood of politics, but the death knell of theology. I believe I am fighting for eternal truths." And one thing I have always found interesting is the way, especially when you're working with students, like, it's very hard to believe that people honestly believed religious beliefs, but we very much believe that they believe their ideologies. And I was sort of wondering about that framework, thinking if you both think that kind of describes some of what we're talking about, what would the unshakable tenets of this belief system be, the things on which there is no compromise? And not to ask you to crystal ball things, but what are the possible ways through or around when there is no compromise, there is no discussion on these things?
Well, one thing I would say, and then I would like to hear Cynthia's thoughts on that, but that way of thinking, that compromise is the death knell. If you politicize that, then you're in trouble, right? And because if you dismiss the possibility that anything somebody who disagrees with you has to say is worth listening to, then dialogue just stops in the country, and you can't govern. You can't look for consensus. You can't find the compromise necessary to solve problems. So that mindset, that habit of thinking that says I'm totally right and you are totally wrong, and if you are totally wrong, you're probably evil also. I mean, all of that is becoming so commonplace now. And Cynthia wrote a section about Newt Gingrich in that regard that I thought was really spot on. I don't know if that's where you want to go, Cynthia, next, but just that way of thinking is so toxic for us, I think.
It absolutely is. How can you possibly have a democracy if there are large groups of people who believe that you don't compromise with the other side? And Newt Gingrich certainly ought to get a lot of the credit or blame for introducing that toxic way of thinking into modern politics. There have been other times in our nation when we were there, the Civil War clearly being an excellent example of that. But in modern political terms, when the nation was doing fairly well, actually, it was in the 1980s when we didn't have a lot to be angry with each other about, as I see it. But Newt Gingrich was ambitious, power hungry. He wanted to win. He wanted to be Speaker of the House. And he thought the way up for him was to introduce this really toxic rhetoric into politics. And so he actually led seminars, conducted classes for Republican congressmen on ways to refer to Democrats, enemy, traitor, un-American. And that has, seeped through our politics and boiled over. Unfortunately, another institution that has become infected with that way of thinking is the conservative Christian church. There are many right-wing Christians who now believe that they are in a life and death struggle for the country. If they give in, evil will reign. Their pastors, people like Franklin Graham, are telling them that, teaching them that. People like Jerry Falwell's son, before he was replaced as the head of Liberty University. So that way of thinking is toxic to politics and to culture. If people believe you're in a life and death struggle, just because people disagree with you on some issues, I think that is really, really troubling for democracy.
Yeah, and I was just pulling up because, oh boy, that Newt Gingrich section is just a person where every little bit you learn about him confirms all your priors.
Yes.
And it really did strike me as a kind of an important tentpole in again thinking about what is Southernize as a verb, in the very conscious, intentional use of people and language personnel to make these changes happen. Like that this guy, you do wonder, he doesn't seem like the kind of person who could get along and get anything done. And his solution to that was to work to make sure that the people who were there were loyal to him and that he didn't have to get on with anyone, which can sound a little like super villainy. But yeah, that you sort of think like no one can really do that much. But when we're talking about it, we're talking about pretty closed systems of elites where there's actually not that many seats that we're talking about. And one thing that struck me very early in the book that was brought up as something that was great about Jimmy Carter, but really struck me as the problem was that what a whiz kid he is, and a great campaign, that they've memorized the election laws in every state, and that you are having to do that. That's actually not like, yay, that's so, what a smart person. Like, that's a mess of a democracy. And I guess thinking about some of the ways that can become a positive approach, some of the things that are happening in the South, thinking about someone like Stacey Abrams, who has just the willingness to make a state what you worry about, as opposed to the nation. Like that you can't fix that, but you can know Georgia and you can work there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of thinking state by state when understanding this past and the future.
What?
Well, I think that strategically that seems to be, I mean, I think she's on to something. I think I mean, we in a way we elect presidents state by state, and because of the Electoral College, and so she recognized that and set out to do it. And in some ways, she embodies that technocratic precision of Jimmy Carter, plus the legacy of John Lewis. You've got to get everybody out to vote that you possibly can. All of those things kind of rolled into one. I think Georgia is interesting too, because something else was happening while Stacey Abrams and others were doing their kind of amazing organizing work, in terms of retail politics and getting out the vote and all of those things. The other thing was that you had Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff running for Senate, often running together because of a quirk in the elections where Georgia was electing two senators at the same time. And so you had the first Black senator and the first Jewish senator from Georgia seeking office at the same time and running together. And so there was also that kind of ethical, spiritual, idealistic, politicking that was taking place in Georgia, as both of these men were quite gifted at framing the debate in a way that appealed to the better angels of people's nature. And it just seemed to me that those parallel tracks in Georgia, I don't know if they thought of it that way themselves or not, but it was a powerful, it was a powerful coming together, a powerful complement one for the other, I thought.
The flip side of thinking about issues state by state, Frye is so right that we do elect presidents state by state. But I think many times we think about the power of the presidency in determining the direction of a nation, and that's true. But I think we overlook sometimes the power of governors and state legislatures. One of the lessons that Republicans took from Raphael Warnock's and John Ossoff's victory in Georgia was that they ought to make it a lot harder for people to vote. And that has been going on state by state. It is in state houses where that battle is being fought, and where there are Republican governors and legislatures controlled by Republicans. They have not only thrown up barriers to the vote, which is bad enough, but they have also tampered with the election machinery, tampered with the power of secretaries of state and elections officials in order to make it easier to overturn a fair and free election if they feel the need to do so. So I think voters, citizens, activists ought very much to think about what they can do at the state level and what they can do at the level of state legislatures.
Yeah, and I think that really resonates in this book. It was wonderful to start with those very specific examples of places like Charlotte, where, explicitly contrasted with Boston, where, these moments of possibility can happen, and the quirks of districting and something like a Senate race, which that's one of the few races where it's raw numbers when you're electing senators from a state. And kind of threaded throughout all of this Southern strategy is the sort of long-term lopsidedness of the political system more generally. I used to have students do an experiment and do the calculations to see how much more weight a vote in Wyoming carried than a vote in California. And sometimes it actually just helps to do the numbers out and to look at those things. And that's, I think, what I really appreciated about this book was that maybe in a way that we yearn for in a lot of contemporary journalism and don't get, like the willingness to just say the thing, the observable thing, that, that Newt Gingrich was a jerk, that he did these things to get around it, that, what was the phrase, that Ronald Reagan was singularly unmoved by the civil rights movement. And to sort of be open about what these things mean, to not kind of play along with concepts of fairness or both-sidedness. I'm not sure it's actually a thing that journalists think about and learn about in school, but the idea that, like, if one party says the sky is blue and the other one says it's red, is it the journalist's responsibility to look out the window and say what color it is? And I think that's something that I really, really liked about this, that it was both a beautifully written book and with just a lot of great turns of phrase, but it was also just really, in a good way, hits you over the head with, like, here are people and places and things that happen that you have forgotten about or you haven't thought about in the context that we're deploying them. And I found it sort of refreshing. For me, I was alive for half of, or aware of the world, at least for half of the period you're talking about. And to see the people that I saw on TV growing up, put into their context, was a really good thing, but also explicitly with a mind towards where we are now. I really appreciated it. There's a lot of great stuff in here, and for those of you who might be thinking about purchasing it through the store, there's some great characters in here. We talked about a lot of really famous folks, famous politicians, but there's some wonderful small stories in here of people doing the work, doing the organizing work in particular, and people going against the grain, people making brave choices. And I think each one of those stories is a good reminder of what the Southernization could mean, and also serves to make the really venal characters stand out all the more. And it's an excellent part of the revisitation of Jimmy Carter in particular. And it is, I'm sure you have experienced this, to teach about the Carter administration to people who aren't already freighted with ideas about what he is like is a really fascinating thing. So we have, all of a sudden, we have quite a few questions, and there's been a big conversation here. Yes, and someone has brought up something that is mentioned in the book, which I think is a really timely thing, that this idea of replacement The idea of replacement theory is mentioned in there pretty early on. Someone posits that some people don't want a democracy, they want a theocracy. And he's not talking about another country, he's talking about this place. I think we kind of got at this, but your thoughts about how we grapple with that desire.
I think that's absolutely true, that there are people ready to throw over democracy. Frye and I both believe that a big part of what is undergirding the chaos of the current moment is fear of demographic change. That by the year 2040, 2045, whites will no longer be a majority of citizens of the country. They'll still be the biggest ethnic group, but they'll be a plurality, not a majority. And I think, we were talking earlier about some people believing that they're in an existential struggle for the life of the country. I think that one of the forces that we have to be concerned about is this Christian nationalist movement. And I want to be clear that I am not attacking Christianity broadly here. I want to be clear that I am talking about those right-wing Christians who are concerned about whiteness, quite frankly, who are afraid of cultural change, who don't want to see the gay rights movement, who don't want to see transgender rights, who would rather have an autocracy with somebody who favors their point of view than have a democracy. And I do think that that is something we have to worry about.
Aaron, I would also say, in addition to that, that the replacement theory idea, while it has taken on a particularly toxic focus. I mean, look what happened in Buffalo. I mean, literally a deadly focus there. The idea is not new. There's a long history, sadly, in this country, certainly going back to post-Reconstruction, in which whites viewed any progress by African Americans as coming at their expense, coming at white expense. If blacks are doing better, whites, by definition, are doing worse. You measure your own loss by the progress of another group, and it's not true. I mean, it just isn't factually true. But that idea has been there, and people have been willing to kill on behalf of that idea for a long time in this country. I mean, that's what lynching and all of those things that stained our land, lynchings at the rate of almost 2 a week for 50 years in this country. I mean, that's an astounding dark spot in the experience of America that emanated from the South. Not all lynchings were in the South, but most of them were. Well, that ability to dehumanize, to be so fearful of people who are different from you making any kind of progress, that you feel like you're going to be, to use that term now, replaced by that. I mean, that's so crazy. It's so dangerous. It's so deadly. And yet here we are.
Yeah. And it kind of gets us back to thinking about, when does the US become a democracy fully? When non-white voters can vote? And when does democracy fail for certain people? When it doesn't produce the outcome that they want anymore. I think is a really difficult thing. And I've been involved, I teach students at the museum, and there've been lots of conversations about civics education being a really important part of this. And I've struggled with that. It seems like we're really way past that point, that the conversation that we're having is not, this isn't again just that people don't know how to vote, or sometimes folks would be like, well, people didn't know about lynchings happening. Well, there were postcards. That's how we know so much. The the unwillingness at times of journalists to just say that a thing is happening. Someone in the questions had said, we're talking about tampering with voting and all of this kind of stuff. Even saying voter suppression seems like it's a difficult thing for some people to say on television. If there were one aspect of all of this that you could see some real forthright honesty from journalists on, not honesty in the sense that I think they're lying, but their fears and the pressures on them to say certain things. Like, what one thing would you like to just have discussed as plainly as possible? In all
I
of
would
what's
like
going
to
on?
see a lot more attention on the subtitle of our book, A
Yeah,
Story of Democracy in the Balance. Frye and I really do believe that the country is at an inflection point
yeah,
where this could go either way. And I think it is difficult for journalists to capture because there are so many moving pieces. There's the January 6th insurrection and the investigation of that. All of the things that we're now learning that Trump and his lawyers and his allies did to try to keep Trump in power. There are the voter suppression efforts that are continually going on. And so I think one difficulty that journalists are having is how to capture all of this. And there is so much going on in people's lives every day. It's hard to persuade people that we may be at a critical moment for the country's future. But I really would like to see journalists and thinkers, public intellectuals, if you will, historians, Aaron,
yeah,
focus more on that.
yeah. Frye, how about you?
No, I think that's really well said. It's a critical moment. We intended the book to be both a warning, probably primarily a warning, but also offer glimmers of hope, that there are people who are still, even as democracy does hang in the balance, there are people working on its behalf. And so we want to celebrate that. And we want to bear witness to that. And we will probably, as we say late in the book, Dr. King used to say that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And we say, well, maybe, but we're not totally sure. I mean, we want to believe it. One of the great eloquent moral spokespersons in the history of the country, we would love to believe that he was right about that. But I think that's being tested now. And there are people who are trying to make it true. But we don't know how it's going to go. And we could wake up and find that it left us behind.
Yeah, I was thinking when you brought up January 6th, one of the tiny bad things of that is that you weren't even allowed to celebrate the joy of Warnock and Ossoff winning, thinking about things that happen right close to each other. You mention the Dylan Roof shooting and Obergefell, these things that line up, that how breathless some of these changes feel. But also, Cynthia, as you pointed out, that the inability to report or to talk about things when they were smaller in some ways now becomes this challenge of how do you say the sky is falling and be taken seriously. And someone asked in their question, sort of put it, this just sounds like the Americanization of America. There are perpetual waves of nativism and xenophobia. Is this challenging our narrative of permanent evolution in social and civic right based on historic events? This is Whig history, this idea that things can only always get better.
Better, yes.
But I think you two are making the argument that this is an important, different moment. This isn't, we can't just say it was ever thus. Yeah.
I certainly think so. Frye just referred to that King quote, that famous King quote, which I believed in for much of my life. But, there are historians now who point out that there is no reason to believe that things continually improve. Now, if you look at American history, it does seem that the country has been ever so slowly, 3 steps forward and 2 back, plodding toward the more perfect union that our founders talked about. But it also seems to me, if you look back on the Civil War, there were moments when it certainly was not clear that the Union was going to win. And what happened in the post-Reconstruction period? African Americans were terrorized for a century after that, particularly in the South. And there was no guarantee that the civil rights movement was going to push the nation in the direction it did. And so I really think now we're at another one of those moments when things could go either way.
What Cynthia said, yeah, I agree with that. And the other thing is that our capacity for dehumanizing each other, which does seem to me to be gaining momentum, as we saw today, can turn deadly, as we saw in Buffalo, can turn deadly. The tragedy that you experienced in Connecticut 10 years ago, I don't know, may have been just one mentally unhinged person, but the politicizing of deadly violence based on dehumanizing people that you don't understand is becoming more and more the norm, I fear, as more and more of an everyday occurrence. And it's just a reminder of the literal insanity of failing to understand that we're in this together as a country. We are inevitably, it is baked in, it is who we are, a multicultural, multiracial country, and we can make the best of it or the worst of it. And it's literally insane not to make the best of it. It is not going to be a good place to live if we don't. And those are the kind of stark, big choices that we believe the country is now coming face to face with.
And Aaron, I wouldn't want to leave tonight. Frye just mentioned 2 horrible episodes of violence. I wouldn't want to leave tonight without at least acknowledging the horrible mass shooting in Texas today. 14 children killed at a school and 1 teacher, I believe. I have no idea what the gunman's alleged motive was. I have no idea whether this is just another madman, another episode of racial violence. I don't know. But I do know that this sort of violence is now a weekly occurrence in this country. And, we have got to learn some method of compromise, sensible compromise, that helps us to solve big problems like that.
Yeah, and to see our senator from this state, whose district, when he was a congressman, included Sandy Hook, literally down on his knees on the floor of the Senate this evening, begging for anything to change. I think
Chris Murphy was so good on that today. It was powerful quotes from him today. He's been really strong on this issue.
Yeah, sadly, he's had far too much practice on this. And I think one thing to take from your book and from our conversation is the extent to which in the moment you don't necessarily know when things are about to change. But one way that you can feel a part of it is to be some agent of change yourself on whatever level you can. And I think the way that you found those stories among everything else, it was a tough book to read, but those things, make you think that maybe the balance isn't gone, that maybe there are paths forward from all of this.
We have to try.
Absolutely.
Because what else is there to do?
Exactly.
Yes.
So again, thank you both so much for talking about this, and thank you, Cynthia, for bringing that up. It was one of those things where it's in the book and it's just everywhere. And I know for both of you, this goes to press, and then immediately things happen where you think, oh, I wish I could change this. But I really do recommend it as a great way for a lot of folks here tonight to do exactly what Cynthia talked about, to rethink people and events that you remember, and kind of enjoy two great thinkers recasting them in some compelling narratives. So again, thank you both for joining us tonight, and thank you to everyone who joined us in the chat. There were some great conversations. I'm sure several of you mentioned, I'm sure Heather Cox Richardson will be happy to know that her newsletter is being read by lots of folks here. A reminder that you can rewatch all of these programs if you joined late or you had a shaky connection. You can watch the program later. Check out the events page to see all of our upcoming programs. I can recommend tomorrow evening, 17 Summers in a Garden, which is an exploration of the interesting thinkers and activists who lived in Nook Farm, the neighborhood in Hartford, where the Mark Twain house is. People who were working for racial justice, working for buried women's property rights, for a variety of things. So that's a great program to join us for tomorrow. Because many of you are regulars, just to let you know, we are going to be moving our programming off of Crowdcast and into Zoom soon. In response to the feedback we've received on previous programming, nothing about the registration process through our website is going to change. The confirmation that you get and the reminder emails will be a Zoom link instead of a Crowdcast link. So thank you again, Frye and Cynthia, for joining me tonight to talk about this. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
You too.